Hi, this is Dr. Daniel Phillip, and I will be your professor for PSY 3021, better known as Professional Opportunities in Psychology. For the record, I don't particularly care if you call me Dr. Phillip or if you refer to me as Dan or Danny or Daniel, since those are my given names. It's not as much of an issue since we don't do face-to-face kind of lectures and meetings, but on emails, or if I speak to anybody on the phone for some reason, not really much of an issue to me. What I usually say is I didn't get a PhD to be called doctor, and that's true. So, I am actually not located in Jacksonville. I live in St. Petersburg, Florida. I lived in Jacksonville for about not quite 9 years, taught at UNF for about 6 years full-time, and then last few years adjunct teaching a course. I had a bit of a career shift and went from teaching to working at the Veterans Administration department. And so I worked for the VA in Jacksonville for about 1.5 years, and then I've been down here in St. Pete for about not quite a year. So I won't have direct office hours, but you can get me via email through the UNF account, and if for some reason we can't arrive upon an answer to your question through email, we can always talk on the phone, so that shouldn't be much of an issue. Let's see, I'll give you a little bit of background on me before we start with notes, just so you have a sense of whether or not you want to how much credence to give to what the hell I have to say in regards to the course and the information we're going to cover. I am a career UFer, so I went to University of Florida for my bachelor's, master's, specialist, and doctoral degrees. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, a minor in math. I have a master's and specialist degree. I have those 2 degrees in an area called mental health counseling, which is generally out of departments of counselor education. Now, if you don't know what that is or have never heard of it, don't worry. We're going to talk more about that as the semester goes on. In fact, in the next couple of installments with degree options and graduate school and so on, we'll be talking about different program areas. And then I have a PhD in counseling psychology. And today we'll talk a little bit about differences between counseling and clinical psychology, as well as different other fields in psychology overall. So I have different degrees in different fields. When did I finish? 2003, I think I got my PhD conferred in 2003. And so I've been out for about 10 years. However, in between undergraduate and graduate work, for 4 years I worked in the field. So I went out and worked for 4 years with a bachelor's degree in psychology. So for those people who say there aren't any jobs, you can't do jobs, that's not true. You're probably not going to make a truckload of money doing them, particularly in the beginning, but there's certainly jobs out there. So in the 4 years that I was in between the end of undergraduate and the beginning of graduate school, I worked in a juvenile prison for about 1 year as kind of a part counselor, part guard. I worked adolescent drug rehab inpatient for a while. I established and enforced court orders for child support for the state of Florida through child support enforcement. And then for about 1.5 years, I worked for foster care. Primarily with heavily delinquent teens, but also generally with teens that had come into the foster care system for any host of reasons. And so there are a number of jobs. Now, those all happen to be within social service arena, but there are a number of jobs that an individual can look to procure with a bachelor's degree in psychology, and we'll talk about those to some extent, again, a little bit down the line when we start talking about jobs that one can have in graduate school applications and undergraduate training and so on. I'm trying to think what else. From a career perspective, even though I've only been out for 10 years, I've really had about 3 different career tracks. In graduate school and then after graduate school, I worked in counseling centers for quite a while. I was assistant director at Jacksonville University for about 3 years. And so I worked in college counseling centers. Then I taught full-time at UNF for 6 years. At the same time, for part of that tenure, I was working at JU as assistant director of their counseling center, and then I also did some private practice on the side when I stopped doing the assistant director job at JU. And then over the last 3 years, I have worked for the Veterans Administration, seeing veterans of the armed forces. Currently in St. Petersburg, I work in a substance abuse treatment program, which is kind of more of my background. But in Jacksonville, I worked in what they call primary care behavioral health, and so I was embedded in with primary care docs, physicians, and saw people usually for short-term therapy issues. And so I've had a few different experiences, not only as a psychologist, but prior to getting my advanced degrees, kind of jobs that I held as an undergraduate, or with an undergraduate degree, I should say. I'm trying to think what else, if there's anything else that's kind of particularly important. Not really. But if you have questions, feel free to shoot me an email and I'd be happy to answer them. Before we get started with notes for this grouping, I wanted to touch base on a couple of things about the syllabus. As you can see, there are no tests, no exams, and so the textbook, which is not the textbook that I usually use, but it had already been adopted by the previous instructor, and I didn't really feel like I wanted to change it up on you guys so that you had to worry about returning a book and then getting another one, and if it's tied into your loans or anything like that, I didn't want to have to change things around. So the readings will be to help you help clarify some of the things we talk about in here. They'll also be useful for you in questions that you have about things like jobs or applying for graduate school and so on, although we're going to cover most of those things in reasonable detail through these video lectures that I'll be posting. However, for the assignments, there are really 3 main assignments that you're going to have for this course. The first is one I've already posted, and that's what I call the career assessment assignment, and that involves completing 3 different assessments on Florida Choices Planner, the instructions which are up on Blackboard. The 3 assessments that you'll need to complete are the interests assessment, the abilities or skills, I think it's a skills one on there, and then the work value sorter, or the values assessment. So you need to complete those 3, and for each one of those, you need to look into basically 2 careers that that come up as a result of your answers. Now, generally speaking, when you complete a vocational assessment, and that's what those are, there are different forms of vocational assessments. When you do that, it doesn't mean that you should do any of those careers, and it doesn't even mean that you would necessarily like or be a good fit. The way that they match up you to those careers is they look at how you answer the questions, and then they have people who are in those jobs answer the same questions. Okay, and so what they do is they look to match those 2 up, and so if your answer is matched fairly highly with people who are in those jobs and report reasonably high levels of job satisfaction, then generally speaking, that's why you would get kind of linked up or matched to a job. Now, it doesn't mean that that's a job that you should do. So for example, when I take those tests, one of the things that often comes up is clergy. Now, I'm not religious, and so being a member of the clergy would probably be a very, very bad fit for me. I wouldn't like it at all. But what it means is that people who are clergy members may very often answer certain things, so it could be a skills-based issue. Maybe some of the skills that I have map out well with clergy members, and particularly clergy members who report levels of job satisfaction, high levels of job satisfaction. Or it could be values. Essentially, interests, abilities, and values are kind of the 3 major areas that are often assessed for career counseling, which is why I have you take those. When I used to do career counseling, those were 3 very, very commonly used assessments. And the truth is, if you score if a job comes around because you scored highly on all three of them and the same job comes up, that's probably a pretty good indication that it would be a good fit for you. And so, for example, if psychologist came up because of your interests and your abilities and your values, then psychologist might be a very good fit for you. If it comes up for two of those, well, it still could be a good fit, but you might not have the interest for it. If your interests aren't in line with it, but your skills and your values are, it might not be a good fit. But if your interests and your values are high and your skills aren't, well, you can usually develop skills. So in any case, as far as the career assessment assignment goes, I want you to review two careers that come up on your interests, on your abilities, and on your values. So there should be 6 different careers that you kind of look at. And for each one, I want you to pick one career that makes sense, that you have considered before or that you would think about having. And I want you to choose one career that either you never considered before, or you don't think would be a good fit, or you don't even know what it is, so that you can kind of learn more about careers overall and get a sense of why it might be that the test indicates you might be a good fit with it. And then just do about a paragraph review, indicating after you read about that through the kind of links through Florida Choices Planner, just an overview of whether you think it fits or not, or whether if you changed your idea or what you learned about it. Just an overview. For all 3 of the assignments are really geared towards helping you either gain information or start you on a track towards a particular plan that you have. And so the career assessment assignment is to help you kind of see kind of a wider range of possible jobs that might fit for you, and that might solidify a job that you've already considered, or it might open the door to something that you hadn't considered prior. The second assignment that we'll have is going to be a resume or a VITA assignment. That doesn't mean that you have to submit both. Okay, you will submit either a resume or a VITA, and when we get there, it'll become clearer. But essentially, if your primary goal upon graduating from UNF with your undergraduate degree is to get a job, I'll want you to compose a resume, okay? Because resumes are essentially the tools that you submit for jobs. If your primary goal is to get into graduate school, then I'll want you to put together a VITA, because VITAs are essentially more detailed versions of resumes that allow you to put more in there. But those tend to be the more standard kind of submissions for graduate school. And so you won't have to do both, you'll just have to do one or the other. Both of them, but particularly resumes, you can actually get help in completing the resume and the VITA to some extent, but you can get help in completing those, or get pointers or tips, or get it reviewed if you go through UNF Career Services Office. The Career Services Office at UNF has counselors that will help you construct, put together, edit, re-edit your resumes and your VITAs. And so that's something for you to very much consider, and since you're students, it's built into your tuition, so it's free of charge. So that can be a very helpful thing. That's your second assignment. That's not due for another probably couple of month and a half or something like that. And then the last assignment will be a career review, where I'll want you to choose a career in which you're interested, that a person with a degree in psychology, whether that's bachelor's, master's, specialist, doctoral degrees, could have. And I will give you a list of kind of questions or criteria that I want you to answer for that career, and I'll show you websites and other resources where you can access that information. Occupational Outlook Handbook, different websites, different print sources, and so on. Although the Occupational Outlook Handbook has a lot of really good information, so. But we'll go over that as well. So those are going to be the 3 main assignments that you're going to have through our course. And again, they're all intended to help you either gain information or gain skills or start to work towards a plan for what you're going to do with your degree when you're done. Okay? And if you have questions, again, shoot me an email, let me know. Additionally, regarding lectures, I don't tend to put lecture notes up. Okay, since I'm going to be doing these video lectures, I'm going to post these. I will put up note shells, and that's the first 2 note shells are up for careers in psychology and degree options. Note shells are there so that you don't have to write every single solitary thing down that I say. I just want you to write down the pieces that are kind of central and important for you, particularly in a course like this where it's not graded A, B, C, D, F, and my intention is not to overly burden you with work. It's to help you kind of get a better grasp on where you want to go and what you want to do with your degree. And so what I want you to be able to do is write down the pieces that are kind of central and important for you, that are going to be the kind of most meaningful. And that's hopefully what your textbook can also do, help clarify questions and give you more information, or at least get you in line with figuring out where you can get more information if the text or if the lectures don't provide what you're looking for. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get started on the careers and psych stuff. One kind of key piece that I would say about your career, about psychology, is as an undergrad, a strategy that I recommend is that you take kind of a broad course space, both within psychology as far as outside. Now, outside of psychology, it's in some ways kind of given because you have to do general ed courses and take, at least 2 biological sciences and 2 physical sciences and a certain number of humanities and so on. But within psychology, even unless you are very, very, very sure of exactly what you want to do, I generally recommend that people take kind of a broad kind of educational or class base within psych. And that's so that you can get a really you can get a better sense of what the different fields do. It also helps make you a little bit more marketable for either going to graduate school or getting jobs in the future. And sometimes when you take courses either that you didn't expect to, or courses that you thought you would like and found that you didn't particularly care for, that can kind of change your mind. It can give you different pieces of information on which to make decisions. And I'll give you an example on that. When was it? As an undergrad, I took, well, I should preface this. As an undergrad, before I started taking most of my psych courses, I figured that I wanted to be a child clinical psychologist. And to that end, I took developmental psych, because that was kind of a child psych course, and I wanted to kind of get a sense of what that was like, and found that I generally enjoyed the course and really liked the teacher that I had, Pat Miller. And we had to do volunteer work as part of the course requirements, and so I went ahead and I volunteered with relatively young children. I think there were about 6 or 7. And I found that I would rather hit myself in the foot with a hammer than deal with children on an ongoing basis. I just found that while I thought I would really enjoy it, I very much didn't. And that was a little dismaying, to say the least. So I did a second bit of volunteering, and I volunteered with teens. They were at-risk teens. They were at risk of dropping out of... They had been held back a couple of times academically, so they were in middle school but were high school age. They were at risk of dropping out. They often had some usually petty crime or some trespassing or some minor legal infractions. And I did some volunteer work with them, and I found that I really, really liked it. I enjoyed it. And so that helped me kind of switch gears as far as where I thought my career might go. And I followed, as I mentioned before, I worked after I got done with my degree, I worked primarily working with teens for, most of those 4 years. And then for probably the first 3 years of my graduate experience, I worked in runaway shelters and did practica in runaway shelters. So I really figured I was that's the track I was going to take. And to this day, I still enjoy working with that population, even though I do very little of that right now. In any case, I tell you that story so that you think about taking kind of a wider range of courses. I thought, for example, that I would like cognitive psychology more than I did, and found that I didn't really like cognitive psychology very much at all personally, but I did end up liking behavioral psych more than I thought I would. So sometimes you get surprised by the nature of the courses that you take and what you get out of them. Second piece, so one is taking kind of a broad kind of approach towards the classes that you take. I also encourage you to really try and engage in different activities, whether it's going to be volunteering or getting a part-time job in the field, just because it gives you experience. Experiences let you know what you probably would and wouldn't like to do, and it can also look good on a resume. And so volunteering, it's something we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester, but volunteering can be a very good thing as well. You get experience, and it may also help you develop a letter of recommendation, and that's something that you're probably going to need for graduate school as well as for jobs in the future. And so it's something to consider doing. Now the truth is, while we're going to be talking primarily about careers in psychology, there are a lot of fields that are similar to psychology, and then there are also a number of fields that are very different from psychology, but where some of the knowledge and the skills and the techniques that you learn in psychology can be applied. So similar fields to psychology include things like, as I mentioned before, mental health counseling, but also things like rehab counseling or social work, psychiatric nursing, psychiatry. And then you have fields that are in many ways very different from psychology, but where tenets of psychology can very often be applied. And so good example of that is business. The fields of marketing and management and sales and even advertising use a lot of psychological tenets. And so your knowledge base of those, particularly in a field like social psychology, can be very helpful. But even other things like personnel work, like working in HR, human resources, or community planning. So there are a number of areas where, even outside that, criminal justice, education, there are a lot of areas where the tenets that you learn or the skills that you learn in psychology can be very useful. In fact, when I was in graduate school, I tutored a couple of people, and both of them went out and got jobs. It was actually funny that they went out and got virtually the same job with two competitors, but they took different tracks to get there. So one was a business major with a minor in psych, and one was a psych major with a minor in business. Both of them ended up getting jobs, one with Office Depot and one with Staples, and they end up doing very similar things, working in product development, but more along the lines of marketing. So how do you like displays and how you would go about marketing the products to the general populace, how you would product placement and those types of things. And so they both had similar skill sets, although their degrees are different. And so if you're interested in business, you can certainly have a degree in psychology. It would probably behoove you to minor in business or get an area of concentration of courses, even if it wasn't a minor, in business, and take something like marketing or management or something that would fit with the area that you're looking to go into. And if you're not sure if you what you want to do, it may be a good idea to do something like that anyway, because there are often a reasonable number of jobs in business, even in a tough economy. So that's a little piece as far as kind of fields outside of psychology. We'll talk about subdisciplines within psychology in a moment. The truth is there are a large number of people that are getting bachelor's degrees in psychology currently, and the number kind of vacillates or fluctuates from year to year, but it's probably somewhere now in that range of about 70,000 a year. Out of those 70,000, maybe about a third go on to graduate work in psychology or a very closely related field like mental health counseling. Probably about maybe a quarter to a third go into graduate work in another field like law or medicine or criminal justice or education or business or any host of things. And then the remainder, a little bit more than a third, probably closer to 40%, actually finish their education with a bachelor's degree. And they go out and they, work or start their own businesses or do any host of things. So getting a degree in psychology doesn't mean you have to go into psychology, nor does that mean you have to be a therapist even if you want to stay in psychology. So, for example, most of the professors that you will have at UNF in the psychology department are not licensed psychologists in the sense that they don't provide therapy or assessment. So the professors that you will have, generally speaking, in cognitive psychology or social psychology or physiological psychology, kind of behavioral neuroscience, IO, any host of areas, a lot of them are not licensed, and they don't need to be licensed. They are able to either teach, do research, or get jobs in any host of other areas. And so when we talk about cognitive psychology, very often cognitive psychologists work in a host of different areas, not just teaching, although that's one of the areas that you very often can work in. I say that so that you don't have the sense that if you're getting a degree in psych, bachelor's degree in psych, that you have to do one thing and only one thing. Sometimes there are a number of jobs or areas that you can go into, and a bachelor's degree in psychology often sets you up to do graduate work in different fields. So I have students that took my classes years ago that are now practicing attorneys or in med school or finished med school. Or they're working in criminal justice, and some that are working in psychology, and some that went out after they got their bachelor's degree and that's what they wanted to do, and now they're out working in the field doing any host of things. So, even though there are a number of people that are graduating with bachelor's degrees in psychology, graduate school tends to be pretty competitive. We'll talk about that later in the semester. We'll talk about that under degree options, probably next module, which will probably come out maybe early next week. But also, we'll talk about it later in the semester when we get to graduate school and we have more specific pieces about it. And so there are a number of people, probably somewhere around 8,000 or 10,000 that are that get master's degrees every year, and there's probably somewhere about 2,500 to 3,000 that are getting doctoral degrees every year. Maybe more, about 3,000 with the PsyDs now. So it still tends to be pretty competitive, and so one of the things we will be talking about in the semester is how to position yourself for graduate school. Truthfully, there are really two kind of foci that I have in this course, and one is going to be graduate school for those people who are thinking about going to graduate school, how to kind of put together your kind of portfolio, if you will, how to position yourself to be as competitive as you can be in graduate school for applying for graduate school and succeeding. And then the second tier is going to be for people who really don't have that impetus, who don't plan on going to graduate school. What can you do, and how can you start to position yourself to be hopefully more competitive in the job market? Lastly, before we get into specific programs, and this kind of prefaces the different subdisciplines of psychology, in some ways, there's this kind of balance between research and application in psychology. Some fields are more applied, some fields are more strictly research-based, and some fields try and weigh those two. But as I mentioned before, you don't have to be a therapist in order to be a psychologist. And the flip side of that is, if you don't enjoy doing research, you can still be a psychologist and do very little research. It just depends on kind of the program area, what you identify as your interests and skills, and how you go about following through on those. Let's see. Let's start looking at some of the programs in psychology. This is not an exhaustive list, but these tend to be kind of the major areas you're going to see. The first is behavior analysis. Behavior analysis is really focused on the tenets of behavioral psychology, and so that would be primarily geared towards either what we usually think of as classical conditioning or operant conditioning. Behavior analysts often, again, like many areas in psychology, they can have a very strong research track where they do research and teach and consultation. but they can also have a very strong applied track. And so people in behavior analysis or behavior analysts often work with patients that suffer from developmental disabilities or may have been diagnosed with autism or Asperger's, which always sounds like a weird Asperger. It actually sounds pretty profane. But in French, I think it's pronounced Asperger, and so in English we call it Asperger's. Anyway, they often work with people who are diagnosed with those mental health diagnoses, but they can do a number of things. The key for behavior analysis is that you really have to be ensconced in and heavily believe in the tenets of behaviorism as being the primary driving force in a person's functioning. And I didn't know a lot about behavior analysis up until probably about 6 or 7 years ago when I met my partner Nicole, who is a behavior analyst, who is a hardcore Skinnerian, drank the Kool-Aid, whole 9 yards. The sun rises and sets with B.F. Skinner in her mind. And so she went and she had a bachelor's degree in psychology and got a master's degree in behavior analysis, and focused on working with both humans and non-humans in training. So part of it was dog training, and part of that became working with people who, as I mentioned before, either suffered from developmental disabilities, what we used to call mental retardation, or people with autism or Asperger's syndrome. Those aren't the only areas that behavior analysts can work in. They can work in behavioral pharmacology or behavioral medicine. They can work in the substance abuse field. They can even work in things like instructional technology. And so very often they can be helpful in teaching people how to acquire certain skills, because behaviorism is really about learning. Second kind of subfield or discipline is what has been termed a variety of things. Used to be termed biological psychology, and for a while it was called physiological psychology. Recently I think it's been considered behavioral neuroscience, but generally speaking it's physio or physiological psych. Physiological psychology is really looking at the effect of the brain on behavior. Now, brain, when we say the brain, we mean that in kind of a wide-ranging effect. So it's not just the brain itself, but it can be the brain's effects on how our body releases hormones, or how our body reacts to certain physical substances, and how that affects our physiological functioning, our biological functioning, and so on. Physio also, for people that are interested in neuropsychology, focusing on physiological psych or behavioral neuroscience or biopsych or whatever we're calling it now, can be very helpful because it gives you a much better understanding of the biological bases for behavior and the biological underpinnings for behavior. Oh, by the way, if I think about it, classically, as far as behavior analysis goes, Dr. Everson was kind of the stalwart for behaviorism in the UNF program, and a very kind of well-known, well-respected, what I would say world-renowned force in that area. And in physio, I know someone recently came in, but when I left about 2.5 years ago from full-time instruction, I don't think they had hired anybody specifically for that. Dr. Lang often did a lot of work in that area, but she also did areas in work in health psych. Third subdiscipline or area within psychology that I'm going to cover is cognitive psych. I group cognitive and sensory in together, although sometimes they're seen as being somewhat separated fields, but my background kind of puts them kind of together. You're looking at human perceptual and cognitive skills, as well as processes, and how that affects kind of human behavior and functioning. Cognitive psychologists often focus on things like judgment, memory, problem solving, reasoning. They'll look at language. They may look at cognitive aging. So how does cognition change over time? And this is an example where two fields may interact. So cognitive and developmental may kind of overlap in something like that. So cognitive psych actually has a variety of kind of applications. The truth is that cognitive psychologists also get jobs outside of what we would normally think of kind of the regular field of psychology, and because of the heavy emphasis on kind of information processing and computer modules in the conceptualization of cognitive psychology, a lot of cognitive psychologists are incredibly apt in computers. And so one of the professors I had at UF used to do work for the armed forces in computer modules. And so he would actually get releases from UF periodically to go work for the military in that area. So sometimes your area can help you develop certain skills that may be useful in other fields. That's very true often with social psychology. Social psychologists, above and beyond kind of normal subdisciplines in psychology, are often seen as being kind of some of the statistical kind of experts, and so they may very often get jobs outside of psychology because of their knowledge of statistical analysis and research design and so on. Hold on, I gotta get a drink of water. Okay. Next up are the fields of counseling and clinical psychology. I kind of group them together because they both tend to be probably the most heavily based on the applied aspect. When you think of a psychologist who provides therapy, you're usually probably thinking of either a clinical or a counseling psychologist, although there's some distinctions between the field. Classically, clinical psychology dealt more with what we would think of as more extreme mental health issues or more chronic mental health issues. And so some of the more kind of difficult diagnoses, chronic diagnoses like schizophrenia, bipolar 1 disorder, maybe even bipolar 2, kind of chronic melancholic depression, difficult forms of OCD, PTSD, things like that. The clinical psych also tends to be a little bit more focused on what we call the medical model. Counseling psychology classically dealt with kind of normal people that were having difficulty in functioning, and so depression, many forms of anxiety, adjustment disorder, substance abuse, any host of kind of disorders like that. I had a friend of mine years ago who made the distinction that counseling psychologists dealt with people with problems and clinical psychologists dealt with problem people. I don't necessarily agree with that, but the distinction between the two usually was the kind of the nature of the severity or the chronicity of the disease. The truth is that over time, the fields have kind of morphed. There are still kind of differences in training and the focus in training, but both allow you to get licensed as a psychologist in every state in the nation. Point in fact, as I mentioned before, my PhD is in counseling psychology, and I work for the VA, and I am considered a clinical psychologist, even though that's kind of the title that they give me. That wasn't, my degree is not in clinical psychology, but I deal with both inpatient and outpatient individuals who are experiencing very kind of severe. I actually tend to do a lot of dual diagnosis work, which means someone who has a substance abuse issue as well as a serious mental health issue. So, but when you think of a psychologist providing therapy or doing testing and assessment, normally it's probably going to be a counseling or clinical psychologist. Okay. Next field is developmental psychology. Developmental psychology is looking for how people develop and mature across the lifespan, and how there are changes in any host of personal variables accordingly. So this is, as I mentioned before, where cognitive and developmental often overlap, is how do people's memory change over time, their ability to process information, reasoning, judgment, and so on. But developmental psychology also looks at kind of changes in emotion, changes in social development, changes in physiological kind of bases. So developmental kind of overreaches a number of different fields that we see. Classically, developmental psych was seen as being a little bit more focused on children, although that's changed over time, and so we really kind of have children as one group. You often have adolescents as a slightly different group. Then you have kind of adults, and then you have kind of more of a geriatric focus. With the geriatric focus being a more kind of, I wouldn't say it's a more recent development, but it's probably gained popularity and kind of focus over the last 20 years, and by all accounts will continue to do so. And in thinking back, as far as cognitive psychology goes at UNF, probably the best example of a cognitive psychologist, which no offense meant to all the people there that do that, I think of our chair, Dr. Mike Tolia. Dr. Tolia is a cognitive psychologist by trade. Dr. Wang is a cognitive psychologist. So there are a number of people working in cognitive psych. Counseling and clinical, Dr. Ibarra, Dr. Fizak, people like that. And then in developmental, you have Dr. Marcon, you have Dr. Perez. So there are people in kind of all these fields, or most of these fields at UNF. That said, one area where classically there hasn't been much of a focus since Dr. Herkoff left a few years back is what we term forensic psychology. Forensic psychology really looks at the interaction between psychology and the legal system. That could be for things like jury selection and eyewitness testimony. It could be for things like interviewing eyewitnesses or being able to gather data regarding a crime scene. But it can also have to do with expert witness testimony. As an example, the person I mentioned, Dr. Herkoff, Dr. Mike Herkoff, he was a professor of mine while I was at UF as a graduate student. Then he went to UNF, and I happened to be at UNF for several years when he was there. And then he went back to UF, I don't know, probably 4 years ago, I guess, maybe 5 years ago. But as a graduate student, I worked with Dr. Herkoff in an area really testing impaired professionals, essentially physicians that become addicted to a certain substance and then essentially get nailed for that addiction, and they often go in for treatment. So I would help them with testing and assessment to see if their cognitive capacities had been compromised at all, if they needed remedial training in certain areas, if there were personality characteristics or variables that may impact their treatment, things like that. So I was working with him on that, but he's essentially a forensic neuropsychologist, and he also worked. He had another kind of gig on the side where he did some private practice work, and one of the areas he did was kind of forensic work, expert witness testimony for testing and assessment and interviewing. And so he called me up one day and he said, "Do you know who Eileen Wuornos is?" And I said, "Sure. She's a female serial killer, and she was on death row in Florida. For those of you who may have seen the movie Monster, that was based mainly on her life. There was some artistic license in there, but he said, he had been asked to do a competency evaluation on her and wanted to know if I was interested in going with him." And I said, "Sure. I mean, how often do you get to meet a serial killer, let alone a female serial killer?" And the fact I was that interested in it might be more telling about me than it is about her. So I went down to. She was being held in a place called BCI, which is a female correctional facility down in Broward County. And I grew up in Broward County, so I knew where it was. So I drove him down there, and we went and interviewed her for several hours, I think 3 or 4 hours, and had done some testing, and then he proceeded to kind of interpret the testing and the interview material, write a report, and submit it to the court regarding her competency, to make sure that she was competent to understand. At the time, she was on death row, and she didn't want any more of her appeals, and the court wanted to make sure that she understood what that meant and what the what the consequences were, so that she would be put to death by lethal injection, as well as see if there were any mitigating factors that would impact the previous sentence that she'd been given. And so that's a good example of what a forensic psychologist may do. They may do testing and assessment and interviewing, and then can do expert witness testimony or submit reports or opinions to the court. Next up, health psychology. Health psychology really looks at not only physical, but also biological and social factors on a person's health or physical functioning. As I mentioned before, Dr. Lang does a reasonable amount of work in the health psychology field at UNF. Health psychologists are often geared towards promoting health and wellness, but also towards helping people change behaviors, particularly health-related behaviors. So that could be weight loss or smoking cessation or stress management, things along those lines. If you like the interplay between the medical arena and psychology, health psychology can be one field to look at. Next up, we have industrial organizational, or what's referred to as IO psychology. I group in human factors or human engineering into this. IO is essentially the interface between business and psychology. Essentially how people function at work, how they relate to work, and just the study of people at work in many ways. There are essentially three kind of areas within IO. One is industrial, one is organizational, one is human factors or human engineering. Industrial psych focuses a little bit more on recruitment, selection, training, and evaluating employees. So it has a little bit more focus on the employee, how businesses can attract, train, evaluate, and retain employees. The organizational piece, O, is more about how the business, the organization, the company functions, but it's more the interpersonal relationships. So how do workers get along with other workers? How do workers interact with management? How does management interact with kind of upper level management? How do supervisors get along with kind of line workers, and so on? So it often has to do with the interrelationships of different levels of employees. And then human factors of human engineering has more of a focus on how workers interact with their environment, but particularly kind of the machines or the pertinent kind of materials in their environment that are related directly to their job. And so IO really focuses on, as I mentioned before, that interplay between business and psychology. Things like they're very interested in individual differences, particularly how that affects a worker's functioning. But things like motivation and morale, efficiency at work. So the idea is trying to maintain a balance between worker satisfaction and optimizing production. And the research in many areas indicates that if you improve worker satisfaction and morale, that production actually increases because people are more efficient. And additionally, you have things like you have less turnover, and turnover is very costly for business. You have fewer people taking fewer sick days, which increases productivity. So, as an aside, IO psychology has their own separate graduate programs, but you don't have to get a degree in IO to become an IO psychologist. So I have two people that I know that I went to graduate school with, one who started a year before me in my PhD program, and one who started a year after me in the PhD program. And both of them work as IO consultants, and they make very good money, but they also have to do a lot of trainings, and so they may have to fly out to different areas and do trainings or assessments and so on. So you don't have to get a degree in IO psychology in order to be a psychologist in IO. I think there are only a couple more, 2-3 more kind of areas, so we'll hopefully get these done in the next couple of moments. The next area is what we refer to as psychometrics, or sometimes quantitative psychology. Psychometrics or quantitative really has two tracks. One is more in the psychological testing and assessment part, and that's more the psychometrics kind of portion. So the focus there is on test construction, test evaluation, test administration, and so on. And to that end, there's psychological testing course at UNF that when I was there I taught for a number of years. That prior to her retirement, Dr. Susanna Urbina used to teach, and Susanna is literally a world-renowned psychometrician. And then the second area is what we often think of as the quantitative psychology piece, which has a little bit more to do with analysis of data. So designing experiments, conducting experiments, and figuring out how to interpret the data for experiments, what statistics to run, and how to interpret that data efficiently and effectively, accurately. Next up is the area of school psychology. School psychology really is the interplay between education and psych. But school psychologists tend to do more either in testing and assessment or in kind of classroom evaluation and teaching strategy. School psychologists don't tend to do much counseling. That's usually done by school counselors, and that's a different field that we'll talk about later in the semester. So school psychologists often will do testing to see if a student may have learning disability or may have ADHD and how that impacts their ability to learn, if they need special classes. They can also be helpful in helping teachers recognize more effective learning strategies to enact in the classroom. So that tends to be more of what school psychologists do. Additionally, school psychology programs are usually located in education departments. So they're not usually in psych departments. And school psychology almost always requires a graduate degree of some form. And then the last kind of subdiscipline is social psychology. Social psychology... Sorry, there are people in the background. Social psychology really looks at how people interact with society, is probably the best way to put it. And so it looks at things that are societal issues like prejudice or stereotyping, but also the effect of sociality on people's functioning. So things like the effect of group membership on a person's cognitive processes, on their decision making, on their behavior. And this is where social psychology often interfaces a lot with business. So a lot of the things that you learn in social psychology play out as important concepts and skills for areas like management or advertising or marketing or even sales. Additionally, as I mentioned before, social psychologists often tend to be some of the studs, for lack of a better term, in the statistical analysis department. And so I knew people in my graduate program who were social psych people. At UF, they share the same floor in the psych building, the graduate programs do. And two people I know went on to work for ETS, Educational Testing Services, the entities that oversee things like the GRE and different testing modules, and they do statistical analysis and test development and construction and so on. Now there are other applied fields and even non-applied fields related to psychology, and so things like mental health counseling, which we'll talk about more later. Sports psychology is another area. Sports psychology is not usually located in psych departments. It's usually located in health and human performance or exercise and sports science, something along those lines. You have art or music or movement therapies that are often located in different areas. And then psychological social work, which is another kind of discipline. And so that's kind of an overview of some of the different fields or sub-disciplines within psychology. I'll sign off for now. That's kept it under an hour, so that's not so bad. Next module we'll be talking about, I believe, is degree options. So we'll talk about not only the different degrees, bachelor's, master's, specialist, and doctorate, what they mean, type of work you'll need to put into, but also how they may vary a little bit from some fields to other fields. So I will sign off for now, and I will post another lecture for you guys probably in the next couple of days. Thanks. If you have any questions, shoot me an email.